The sky was tinged with a melancholic gold as the carriage finally reached the edge of the city center, where wealth rubbed its opulence against the ancient stones of the streets and in the gazes of those who upheld it without ever touching it. The sound of the wooden wheels over the cobblestones echoed like a warning, announcing the arrival of something or someone out of the ordinary. Inside the carriage, Leah remained silent, her body motionless like a living statue, her eyes devoid of tears, having already cried them dry. Her wrists still bore the marks of the rope, though the linen scarves wrapped around them tried to conceal the recent brutality of her journey. She was a young woman of singular beauty, with delicate features and eyes as deep as the approaching night. But more than her appearance, there was a presence about her that even the silence of pain could not erase. It was as if every movement, no matter how restrained, glided with the natural elegance of someone born to walk freely, not to be transported like merchandise. The building where they stopped was of imposing architecture, with light stone walls, tall, adorned windows, gilded frames, and red velvet curtains that filtered the interior light with an almost dreamlike glow. This was the famous brothel of Madame Vivian, a place coveted by powerful men, where lust wore fine garments and morality undressed with the ease of someone who never knew shame. The name of the place did not appear on any signs. Its fame traveled in whispers and secret invitations, with doors always open to nobility, bourgeoisie, and the debauched seeking refuge in the arms of women molded to please, even when their souls screamed in silence. Leah was led up the entrance steps by an indifferent-faced employee, whose grip on her shoulders was too firm not to be in order. Inside, the hallways boasted paintings by forgotten artists, tapestries embroidered with mythological scenes, and tall mirrors that reflected not just the image, but the state of soul of anyone who dared to look. The soft light of the oil lamps, mixed with the thick scent of incense and exotic flowers, created an atmosphere that was both seductive and oppressive. Leah took a deep breath, allowing the air to enter slowly through her nostrils, but she felt no relief. Everything there seemed gilded on the outside and rotten within. Madame Vivian emerged from the top of the staircase like a theater lady, wrapped in a black dress embroidered with silver threads, her hair perfectly pinned up in a high bun, her eyes assessing the new acquisition with almost surgical precision. She didn't need to approach much to realize there was something different about Leah. Even silent, even broken, Leah carried an upright posture, an air of dignity that none of the dozens of girls in the house possessed. The servants whispered among themselves, surprised by the arrival of someone with such presence. Madame Vivian, without saying a word, simply made a gesture with her hand, and two women approached to take Leah to the preparation quarters, a small room adorned with vanities, perfumes, and dresses, where each new girl was transformed into an instrument of desire. Leah remained quiet as they washed her hair, perfumed her skin, and dressed her in a light, sheer robe without even asking for permission. Her eyes, however, wandered through the cracks in the window, searching among the city's shadows for a final trace of freedom. That night, she would be presented to the most select guests, those who paid more for exclusivity and often competed for the newcomers as if they were jewels at an auction. Her beauty was not the kind that screamed, but rather the kind that forced the room to fall silent just to observe her. Even in that space where bodies were sold and dignity was a currency in extinction, Leah didn't seem to belong. She was like a flame that, even smothered, still insisted on burning. While the other girls whispered in the corridors about the new star of the night, Leah finished being dressed and adorned with necklaces and earrings that would never belong to her. The dress, a deep blue with discreet embroidery, revealed the natural elegance of her shoulders and the bearing that no captivity had managed to erase. The shadows cast by the candles danced across her features as if they reflected the pains of her story and at the same time hinted at a future yet to be written. There, among women who had learned to smile with empty eyes, Leah kept her face serene, as if within her there was something that not even fate dared to break. To the sound of soft music coming from the main hall, Leah was led down a long corridor to the lower floor, where the night unfolded with laughter, toasts, and whispered promises among crystal glasses. The male figures slowly turned toward the staircase as she appeared at the top of the steps. Eyes widened, murmurs ceased for a moment. She wasn't just another beautiful woman. She was a presence that commanded respect without saying a word. Madame Vivian watched from the side, satisfied with the impact caused. To her, Leah was a valuable bet, a new piece on her chessboard, and that night would be the first move. Inside, Leah remained wrapped in a haze of emotions. Fear pulsed like a muted drum within her chest, but her expression stayed firm. The light from the central chandelier illuminated her features with an almost ethereal glow, while the shadow of the staircase danced behind her as a reminder that, no matter how beautiful the night was, there was still darkness around her. In that instant, without being able to imagine it, fate was already preparing to cross her path with someone who would change her story forever. But on that first night, she was still just Leah, the young woman torn from her own land, forced to wear seduction as a mask, but whose soul, silently, still resisted. The main hall, already warmed by the music and the forged smiles of the courtesans, fell into a brief and unsettling silence when the central doors opened, revealing the figure of Lord Alexander Ravenshire. He was not a man who stood out solely for his appearance, though his aristocratic features, upright posture, and tailored dark attire were enough to draw glances. It was something subtler, yet magnetic. His presence seemed to alter the pace of the environment, as if the very air around him slowed down to accompany him. Even among nobles and powerful figures, Alexander commanded a kind of silent authority, shaped by his reputation as a reserved, uncompromising, and enigmatic man. His arrival had not been announced, nor was it expected that evening, and perhaps for that reason, it caused such astonishment. Madame Vivian, who was rarely surprised by any visitor, slightly raised an eyebrow as she watched him cross the hall with slow but determined steps, his eyes scanning the room not with desire, but with a restrained, almost calculated search. Among the young women gathered around the guests, the forced smiles briefly ceased, as if they all, intuitively, realized they were not in the presence of an ordinary client. Some tried to catch his attention with suggestive glances and rehearsed poses, but he did not linger on any of them. Alexander was not a man to be seduced by performances. His eyes, of an icy shade that contrasted with the warm decadence of the environment, sought something he himself could not quite name. It was then, as he raised his gaze toward the staircase, that his eyes met Leah's, who was still slowly descending, accompanied by Madame Vivian's assistants. The connection established at that instant was not made of words, nor of evident gestures. It was like an ancestral bond, sealed by silence, as if both instinctively recognized a similar pain in different spheres of existence. Leah, with her resigned elegance and gaze laden with unspoken words, did not look away. It was as if, even without knowing, she had already been waiting for him. The environment around them remained suspended for a few seconds. The laughter had ceased. The murmurs turned into surprised whispers. Madame Vivian observed attentively, her instincts on high alert. Alexander remained still for a moment, then took a few steps toward Leah, not with the urgency of a man overtaken by desire, but with the firmness of someone who had already made a decision. He asked no questions, nor did he bargain. With a single gesture and a few words spoken softly to the hostess, the transaction was sealed. There was no auction, no dispute. Madame Vivian, though accustomed to dealing with powerful men, realized at that moment that nothing would make him change his mind. Leah would belong to Alexander, and not for one night, as other clients wished, but for something more lasting and obscure. The reaction of those present was immediate: shock, veiled indignation, curiosity. Some men frowned, disconcerted at having lost the opportunity to enjoy the new girl. The women, in turn, cast sidelong glances at Leah, not out of envy for her beauty, but for the singularity of her fate. No one had ever been taken from that place in such a manner, so suddenly, without even fulfilling the debut night. It was an unprecedented event, and for that very reason, shrouded in a mix of scandal and fascination. Leah, for her part, kept her face impassive, even as she was removed from the hall and led to the carriage. There was no surprise in her expression. It was as if her body merely followed an unknown script, while her mind still tried to grasp what was truly happening. In the carriage, the city lights reflected on the glass windows, casting shadows over the faces of the two silent passengers. Alexander remained quiet throughout the entire journey, his eyes fixed on the outside, as if pondering the weight of his own choice. Leah, seated across from him, kept her back straight, her hands resting on her lap, her heart tightened between the uncertainty and the somber relief of leaving behind that place where everything reeked of the death of the soul. She did not know what to expect. She did not know if she had traded one captivity for another even more cruel. But there was something in the way Alexander looked at her, without devouring her with his eyes, without reducing her to a body, that stirred a strange restlessness in her chest. It was not yet hope. It was merely a pause in the pain, a kind of suspension between one fate and another. The mansion they went to was a building far from the city center, surrounded by ancient trees that bent over the walls as if guarding secrets. The iron gate creaked as it opened, and the carriage advanced along a stone path until it stopped in front of an entrance flanked by columns and stained glass. The property, though somber at first glance, had a solid and quiet beauty, a faithful reflection of its owner. When Leah stepped out of the vehicle, she felt the cold ground beneath her feet, and the air lighter than she had expected. There was none of the thick smell of wine and sweat as in the brothel. There was wet earth, jasmine, and a silence that did not hurt. It merely observed. A tall woman with a stern expression was waiting at the entrance. Margaret, the housekeeper, received curt orders from Alexander and led Leah inside the residence, without ceremony or kindness. Leah walked through the mansion's hallways under Margaret's watchful gaze, feeling like a foreigner amid the carved furniture, linen tapestries, and heavy curtains. The old paintings on the walls, the silver candelabras, and the polished floors did not disguise the coldness of the environment. There, everything seemed beautiful but distant, as if time had stopped to preserve memories that no one dared touch anymore. She was placed in a small servant's room with simple but clean furniture, where she was given cotton clothes and basic instructions about schedules and tasks. No one explained why she was there. No one tried to welcome her. But for the first time, Leah did not feel exposed like merchandise. She was still a prisoner of circumstances, but something had changed. The moon, already high in the sky, poured through the bedroom window, casting a silvery light across the wooden floor. Leah sat at the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold surface beneath her, and gazed at the soft beams of light filtering in. She thought about the family she had lost, the world she had left behind, and the strange man who had pulled her away from a cruel fate without revealing the reason. It had begun there, on that silent night, a new chapter of her life, not free from pain, nor immune to fear, but different. Alexander's presence was still a mystery, but his gesture had rewritten the contours of a future that, just hours before, had seemed sealed in darkness. The night was well advanced when Leah was officially introduced to the new reality that, though announced to her in the carriage, only now was taking concrete form before her eyes. The promise Alexander had made, that she would merely be a maid in the mansion, seemed at first glance just a softer form of imprisonment, a euphemism to maintain control over her newly lost freedom. However, as she was led through the mansion's expansive corridors by Margaret, the stern-faced, firm-stepping housekeeper, Leah realized that this new world operated under rules vastly different from those she had known. The environment unfolding before her bore no resemblance to the decorated chaos of the brothel. Instead of forced laughter and cloying perfumes, there was silence, sobriety, and an almost impenetrable order. The mansion seemed alive in its quietude, as if it breathed in the shadows and watched every step taken by those who lived within it. The room assigned to her was small but clean, with bare walls, a narrow wooden bed, a 3-drawer dresser, and a basin with a water pitcher. Above the bed, a rectangular window allowed the faint moonlight to enter, spilling across the corners of the floor like a silver veil. Leah sat slowly, tracing the folds of the bedspread with her fingers, as if trying to decipher through the fabric the fate that awaited her in this new space. There were no kind instructions, no words of welcome. Margaret, always efficient and impersonal, limited herself to giving practical directions about what was expected of Leah in the mornings. Schedules, tasks, prohibitions. The housekeeper's tone was not cruel, but distant, like someone following a mechanical protocol, indifferent to the origins or feelings of the new servant. To Margaret, Leah was just one more among the many faces that came and went, with stories she didn't bother to know. In the first days, Leah had to adapt to a strange routine, where everything seemed calculated, regulated, burdensome. Her body, still marked by exhaustion and the pain of having been torn from her family, moved slowly through the assigned tasks. There was no time to cry, nor space for lament. Each dawn was announced by the metallic sound of the kitchen bell and followed by hours of silent activity, cleaning corridors, scrubbing floors, organizing shelves, polishing the candlesticks in the main hall, tending to the greenhouse of ornamental plants. Margaret supervised everything with watchful eyes, pointing out mistakes without raising her voice, but making it clear that perfection was expected. The other household staff, most equally reserved, kept a certain distance from Leah, as if her presence there was an uncomfortable reminder of an unusual decision from upstairs. Alexander was rarely seen in the hallways during the day, and his absence served as a constant shadow over all the rooms of the house, as if his very name was enough to sustain the silence. As the weeks passed, Leah learned to observe. The mansion, though imposing on the outside, also seemed built for emotional confinement. The paintings hanging on the walls depicted ancestors with stern gazes, as if they were silent judges still guarding the pride of past lineages. The heavy furniture, the Persian rugs, the crystal chandeliers, all of it displayed an elegance that, to Leah, represented not comfort, but the burden of a history that didn't belong to her. Yet, among the dark corridors and rigid rules, she began to find small cracks of humanity. The elderly cook who offered her pieces of freshly baked bread when Margaret wasn't looking, the younger maid who lent her a hairbrush before dinner, even the animals on the property, the silent cats wandering the garden and the horses in the stables, seemed more welcoming than the human faces she shared her days with. Margaret, though inflexible, did not treat her cruelly, and gradually Leah came to understand that beneath that armor of coldness was a woman who also carried scars. She had simply learned to hide them beneath discipline. In rare moments when tasks were completed with precision, Leah noticed small gestures of recognition from the housekeeper, a change in tone, a nod, an extra minute of rest. These fragments of acceptance became anchors for her. She was no longer seen as the exotic outsider brought in on a whim by the master, but as someone who was beginning to fulfill a role within the house's machinery. Even without understanding Alexander's reasons, Leah was starting to assume her place, not with pride, but with a kind of quiet resignation. During the nights, while everyone slept and the wind whispered through the trees on the property, Leah stayed awake, sitting by her bedroom window. She watched the moonlight filter through the treetops, creating delicate patterns on the ground, and allowed herself to remember her mother, her siblings, a time when the sound of laughter still existed. It was in those moments that the longing hurt the most, invading her chest like a slow and relentless tide. The mansion's solitude, which during the day was masked by routine, became almost unbearable at nightfall. Still, Leah endured. The same strength that had kept her upright in Madame Vivian's house now upheld her dignity in the face of her new master's indifference. She knew she could not bow her head completely, even if everything around her demanded submission. There was something inside her that still burned, a remnant of pride, a desire for freedom that not even pain could extinguish. Alexander's figure, though absent most of the time, was becoming a constant presence in her thoughts. Leah did not understand his intentions, but recognized the discreet care in the small concessions granted to her. The house's library, for example, a place no servant usually entered, was indicated to her by Margaret as one of the rooms she should clean weekly. Entering that space for the first time, Leah felt something different, not fear, but a silent reverence. The shelves filled with books, the scent of aged wood and old paper, the oak desk with dry quills and worn inkwells, all of it seemed to pulse with stories waiting to be discovered. And even though she wasn't explicitly permitted to touch the volumes, Leah ran her fingers lovingly along the spines of the books, like someone reuniting with an old friend. Those closed pages seemed to invite her into a world where pain could be temporarily forgotten. Thus, day after day, Leah began to transform within this new reality, not because she had accepted servitude as her fate, but because she had learned to recognize that resisting, even in silence, was also a form of struggle. Each morning that she rose without complaint, each task carried out with precision, each word spoken with dignity in the face of the other servants' veiled contempt, she reclaimed fragments of herself. She was not yet the empowered woman that time would shape her into, but she was no longer the young girl shattered by the separation from her family. In silence, like someone planting roots in the hardest soil, Leah began to bloom where everything around her seemed to deny her light. Leah's first days as the official maid of Ravenshire Manor were marked by a series of hostile silences. and glances laden with judgment. If before her presence was merely an inconvenient novelty in the hallways, now she had become a visible and constant piece on the chessboard of the household routine. Integration into the daily service did not happen naturally. The tasks assigned to her required meticulous attention, absolute discretion, and, above all, a silent obedience that many expected from her as something innate, but which Leah offered with a posture that surprised, not out of submission, but out of dignity. She was a serene yet firm presence, someone who performed her duties without haste, but with a care that bordered on reverence. Even in the face of the veiled hostility from the other servants, Leah did not allow the pain of rejection to show. It was as if she wore an invisible mask that shielded her from indifference and cruelty, disguised as courtesy. The impact of her presence, however, was felt more deeply among those who orbited Lord Alexander's decisions, especially Victoria. The woman, with features sculpted with elegance and eyes that carried the bitterness of lost control, began to walk the corridors more frequently since Leah's arrival. Her past with Alexander, though never spoken aloud, was common knowledge. It was she who, in other times, occupied the intimate spaces of the house, who sat at the table with the familiarity of someone who believed herself irreplaceable. Leah's arrival, even though her position was technically inferior, rekindled in Victoria a rage she herself seemed unable to contain. Upon seeing Leah in the corridors, her eyes would narrow like blades, and her words, when directed at the young maid, were laced with subtle venom, calculated gestures, contradictory orders, silent provocations. The mansion, already cold by nature, became even more somber with that growing tension. Leah, for her part, quickly understood that she would need to learn how to navigate through invisible traps. It wasn't enough to simply perform her tasks well. She had to do so without provoking, without seeming haughty, without leaving room for malicious interpretations. Alexander's library and office became her fixed workspaces, a choice that at first seemed far too generous, but soon revealed itself as a delicate arena where every step required precision. It was there that she spent hours removing dust from old volumes, organizing documents with unknown dates and names, cleaning the corners of windows and the bases of bookshelves with a dedication that was almost ceremonial. It was there, among walls lined with knowledge and aristocratic memories, that Leah began to transform into something more than just a maid. Not by choice, but through the way that silent environment awakened in her a feeling that had long been suffocated, the desire to understand the world to which in some way she now belonged. Every book she touched seemed to pulse with someone else's memories. The volumes in French, Latin, German spoke of eras, wars, loves, and distant philosophies. She didn't dare open them immediately, but she read their titles with the curiosity of a hungry soul. The papers on the desk, letters, seals, contracts, revealed the vastness of business and obligations that made up the life of a man like Alexander. Leah didn't know his mind, but she was beginning to see traces of his personality in the precise organization of objects, in the kinds of books he preferred to keep in view, in the discreet paintings of landscapes and old maps that decorated the room. And, without realizing it, she was beginning to construct a clearer image of him, even though he was rarely present. That constant absence gave her space to reflect, to imagine, and, even against her will, to create invisible ties with someone who seemed to hover above everything. Her relationship with the other servants did not improve over time. Some limited themselves to ignoring her, while others muttered muffled criticisms as she passed by. There were those who thought Leah was being favored, that never before would a new maid be allowed to circulate in the library, that her presence was an affront to tradition. Leah felt the weight of those judgments, but instead of shrinking, she maintained her serene posture, with her shoulders held high and her gaze calm. If inside her heart still burned with longing and insecurity, on the outside she appeared impeccable. It was her way of surviving. Margaret, with her usual rigidity, never praised her, but also did not reprimand her. That was a sign, however subtle, that her conduct was within expectations, and that, in that scenario, was already an achievement. Victoria, however, became more impatient each day. Her obsession with proving that Leah was an intruder began to manifest in more obvious actions. She would deliberately spill wine on freshly cleaned carpets, switch around task orders, accuse Leah of negligence even without proof. She tried, in vain, to provoke a reaction that would discredit her. But Leah, despite everything, did not yield. Her resistance was made of eloquent silences and careful responses, and that control, more than any word, began to shake Victoria's confidence. There was no way to defeat someone who didn't react in the expected ways. Leah didn't fight with visible weapons. Her shield was dignity, and her sword, mastery over herself. And that kind of strength was what most disturbed those accustomed to winning through shouting or emotional blackmail. The seasons began to change, and with them, the atmosphere of the mansion. The leaves in the garden turned ochre, the hallways grew damper, and the fireplace was lit earlier. Leah adjusted her routine to the new rhythm of the house with the same precision with which she arranged the bookshelves in the study. And although she was still treated as a stranger by many, she now knew the paths of the property like the back of her hand. She knew which doors creaked, which windows let in more wind, where the afternoon light fell most softly. These small details, invisible to others, gave her a sense of belonging that no explicit recognition could offer. It was as if, despite the barriers, she was gradually leaving invisible marks on the structure of the house, shaping herself to it and being shaped in return. It was in this in-between space, between rejection and respect, between forced labor and silent introspection, that Leah began her new phase. She still did not understand exactly what Alexander expected from her, nor did she know why she felt that inner discomfort every time her footsteps echoed through the library, or when she smelled his cologne in the air, even without seeing him. But something inside her was beginning to shift, slowly, like a river resuming its course after a long drought. The pain of loss still resided in her soul, but now it shared space with something new and indecipherable. Ravenshire Mansion, with all its secrets, intrigues, and silences, was becoming the stage for her reconstruction, and Leah, without realizing it, was no longer the same woman who had entered there just days before. Since Leah had taken on the role of maid in charge of the mansion's most intimate quarters, including the study and the library, the days began to acquire a different rhythm. It was as if the air in the hallways grew heavier, charged by a silent tension, something undefined that lingered between unsaid glances and restrained gestures. Alexander, even while maintaining his reserved and aristocratic posture, began to circulate more frequently through the rooms where he knew Leah would be. No words were exchanged, nor open demonstrations made, but something deeper began to build in the intervals of those silent encounters. An almost invisible attention, a carefulness in actions, a veiled interest that escaped the eyes of others, but not of time, which recorded everything. Alexander's eyes, once always turned to the books or papers that filled his world with contracts, maps, and letters, now frequently shifted, even if just for brief moments, to Leah. He noticed not only her beauty, which had been evident to him since that first night at the brothel, but now allowed himself to perceive the details of the woman beneath the surface, the way her fingers glided over the furniture as she cleaned, the way her eyes got lost among the spines of the books, as if trying to decipher the worlds contained within. It was a curiosity that was gradually transforming into admiration. And this admiration, though still formless and without destination, created a discreet current between them, something that grew in silence, like moonlight touching the water without ever making a sound. In an unexpected gesture, Alexander allowed Leah not only to clean the books but also to read them. He did not announce this decision. He merely left a small volume with an aged leather cover and already yellowed pages on the desk in a visible corner, as if it had been forgotten there by chance. Leah understood the gesture. She did not ask, did not hesitate. She took the book, and after finishing her tasks, sat on the floor of the library, in the part farthest from the windows, where the light was soft and discreet, and began to read. It was an old novel, set in distant lands, full of characters who faced destiny with courage and sensitivity. As the pages unfolded, Leah felt transported, touched by words that until then belonged only to her soul, but now found a voice. This gesture marked the beginning of a subtle yet constant change in the dynamic between the two. Alexander began to leave new volumes on his desk, carefully chosen. Leah, in turn, read them eagerly and, at times, left small markers with dried flowers or discreetly noted a word she did not understand, as if hoping he would notice. And he did notice. He noticed everything: the altered order of the books, the flowers between the pages, the way Leah lingered longer on volumes of poetry than on historical treatises. And even though they said nothing to each other, there was an exchange, an invisible communion that blossomed through words written by others, but redefined in that unlikely encounter between such distinct worlds. The days went on, and with them, the mansion began to witness these approaches in the form of transformed routines. Leah was now responsible not only for caring for the library, but also for delivering reports and personal letters to Alexander's desk. She spent more time near him, even though their interactions were shaped by formality. But there was something in the way their eyes met that belied any attempt at distance. Sometimes, when placing a paper on the desk, Leah noticed that Alexander would pause what he was doing as if waiting for that moment. And although there was no touch, there was a silent electricity between them. It was the kind of tension that did not need to be named to be real. The feeling that was blossoming between Leah and Alexander was anything but simple. It was layered, building up like veils over the light. He was a man marked by the rigidity of his class, raised to suppress emotions and hide vulnerabilities. She was a woman who had intimately known the pain of loss, the loneliness of servitude, and the constant need to prove her worth in a world that treated her as invisible. But perhaps because of that, because they were both survivors of shattered inner worlds, the connection between them grew stronger. Alexander, even without realizing it, found in Leah an anchor for feelings he had never allowed to surface. And Leah, still wrapped in the uncertainty of her new reality, saw in him not just the master of the house, but a restless soul, constantly at war with itself. In the corridors of the mansion, the servants had begun to whisper, though discreetly, about how often Leah was seen in the more noble wings. Margaret observed everything with the same steady gaze as always, betraying no emotion. Victoria, on the other hand, had intensified her vigilance and her silent indignation. The relationship between Leah and Alexander still had no name, but the change was visible even to those who pretended not to notice. There was more than just kind gestures or unusual permissions. There was a growing intensity in the silences they shared, in the way Alexander's eyes lingered on Leah's delicate features, in how she seemed to bloom slowly, like a flower opening even in barren soil. Sundays in particular had become symbolic in this new, unspoken arrangement. They were days with fewer obligations and more calm. Alexander remained in the library for long hours, and Leah, even when she didn't need to, found excuses to stay nearby, reorganizing books, cleaning the candelabras, adjusting the curtains. They both knew that the time they shared was more than mere coincidence. There was something in that space of dark wood, the scent of old paper, and the dim light that allowed barriers to fall, even if slowly. Leah began to smile more. Alexander began to relax his shoulders. The air between them took on a different fragrance, less burdened by rules, closer to the truth. Yet, even with the silent growth of their connection, Leah knew she could not fully surrender to the feeling that was beginning to take shape. She was still a servant, still a woman marked by the scars of an imposed past. She still didn't understand the limits of Alexander's gestures, whether he was merely curious, enchanted, or something more. So she remained alert, even when her heart beat faster at the sound of his presence. There was a mixture of fear and hope that dominated her nights. Fear that all of it was nothing more than a fleeting game, and hope that, finally, something genuine could emerge from the ruins of their histories. Alexander also faced his own ghosts. He lived divided between the desire that was beginning to dictate his actions and the awareness of his role in society. Falling in love with a servant was more than a scandal. It was an affront to the very system that upheld his existence. But the more he observed Leah, the more he saw in her not just a woman, but a reflection of everything he had lost over the years: emotional freedom, spontaneity, truth. With each passing day, Leah silently dismantled the internal walls he had spent decades building, and the most surprising thing was that she did it without asking for anything in return. It was her presence, her restrained sweetness, her quiet strength that disarmed him. Thus, amid silent routines and unspoken gestures, the bond between Leah and Alexander grew like the shadow of the moon stretching across the ground as night fell, discreet, serene, but impossible to ignore. And even if they did not yet dare to name what bound them, they both knew they were tied to something greater than themselves, something that, fragile as a flame exposed to the wind, burned with the intensity of a feeling that, soon, could no longer be contained. As the weeks passed, the quiet closeness between Leah and Alexander became visible, even to those who tried hardest to pretend nothing had changed. The mansion, once rigid in its routines, seemed to breathe to a new rhythm, influenced by an invisible energy growing between the two. But not everyone viewed this change favorably. Among the luxurious corridors and halls adorned with French tapestries, watchful eyes monitored Leah's every step, waiting for the slightest misstep. And among these gazes, the most burning and venomous was Victoria's, the former lover of Alexander, who now saw her position threatened by a woman who, in her eyes, was nothing more than a servant with an air of naivety. Victoria was the kind of woman who knew how to navigate the unwritten rules of the nobility. With calculated charm and a beauty that aged defiantly, she had always managed to get what she wanted, including Alexander's attention for many years. Leah's arrival, however, had stirred a deep discomfort within her, not just because of Leah's past or her humble origins, but because of what she represented, the real possibility of being replaced not by another lady of society, but by someone who didn't belong to that world. That, for Victoria, was intolerable. Her pride would never allow a servant to be seen as someone worthy of affection, much less the silent consideration of Alexander. Thus began a series of small traps, all meticulously orchestrated, always out of reach of the housekeeper, Margaret, whose rigidity made any accusation difficult to sustain without solid proof. Victoria moved with stealth, using maids she trusted to spread rumors about Leah, distorting her actions, insinuating improper behavior. On one of the coldest days that month, she switched the order of tasks on the duty board and made Leah responsible for failing to complete a chore that had, in fact, never been assigned to her. On another occasion, she deliberately placed an expensive vase, a gift from a foreign ambassador, in the path where Leah was supposed to clean, and the object fell and shattered into dozens of pieces right after Leah touched its unstable pedestal. The maids, torn between fear of Victoria and sympathy for Leah, watched everything with nervous eyes. Some tried to warn Leah, but knew there was little they could do against the influence Victoria still held over certain members of the household. Leah, for her part, endured everything in silence. She had been accustomed to injustice since her days at Madame Vivian's brothel, and understood that in this elitist and masked environment, any exposed weakness could be fatal. Still, there were days when she felt the weight of humiliation tightening in her chest. It was a dull pain, accumulating on her back like the dust on the furniture she cleaned, invisible to others, but real to her. Alexander, however, was not blind. Even immersed in his responsibilities, he noticed Victoria's twisted maneuvers. The breaking of the vase was the final straw. Although no one accused her directly, he knew. He didn't need evidence when Victoria's behavior screamed for itself. Without scandals, without confrontations, Alexander simply made it clear, through firm actions, that Leah was under his protection. The glances that once went unnoticed became more evident. The orders, previously given to other servants, were now directed straight to her. Leah's time in the library was extended, and, more importantly than any visible action, Alexander distanced Victoria with elegance, no longer inviting her to smaller dinners, excluding her from social activities that had once been frequent. This change in posture further inflamed the conflicting emotions within the mansion. For Victoria, it was more than rejection. It was a public defeat. Her disdain for Leah intensified, but now it was accompanied by a certain fear, for she realized that Alexander was no longer the man he once was. There was something new in his gaze, a restrained fire that not even she, with all her experience, could fully interpret. And perhaps because of that, she began to fear what would come next. For Leah, the situation wasn't easy either. Although she knew Alexander was defending her, she felt discomfort at the idea of being the center of an unwanted dispute. She was there to survive, to rebuild herself, and yet, she had become a piece in a game she hadn't chosen. The emotional tension between Leah and Alexander grew stronger day by day. There was a restraint, a hesitation that no longer fit only in silences. In their brief encounters, every gesture carried a new weight. An accidental touch of hands, a glance that lingered longer than it should have, a word spoken with excessive softness. Everything seemed ready to overflow. Leah, though grateful for Alexander's defense, kept her feelings locked away. She knew she couldn't allow herself to believe in an impossible love. What she felt grew like a flame dancing in the dark, but it was also a threat to her integrity. She had been broken before. She had trusted men who promised much and offered little. That's why she protected herself with the shield of duty, maintaining her composure even when her heart pounded too loudly. Alexander also struggled. He fought against himself, against the social constraints that had always shaped him, against the image he needed to maintain before others. A lord, rational, untouchable, coherent. But inside, the sight of Leah unsettled him. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that existed with intensity. It was something deeper. It was the way she walked through the halls expecting nothing from anyone, how she read his books with reverence, how she endured Victoria's provocations with the dignity of someone who had already lost everything, but refused to let her pride be taken. Alexander saw in Leah the woman he wished he could be capable of reaching, but he also knew that one wrong step could destroy her, and that he would not allow. On a rainy late afternoon, Alexander saw her crossing the garden toward the greenhouse, where she would gather herbs for the evening teas. Her figure, hunched under the weight of the wet cloak, walking steadily despite the rain and mud, seemed more striking to him than any speech or declaration. There was the woman everyone tried to diminish, but who rose up every day, silently, with a strength that many would never understand. It was at that moment that Alexander realized he couldn't keep pretending indifference for much longer. The fight against his feelings was becoming useless, and Leah, even without knowing it, already occupied a space within him that no other woman had ever touched. Even so, both kept trying to resist, driven by fear, by logic, by a sense of self-preservation, but what existed between them could no longer be denied. The mansion, now divided between complicit glances and murmurs of disdain, had become the silent stage for a passion in gestation. And between Victoria's attempts at humiliation and Alexander's protective gestures, Leah walked the fine line between desire and duty, trying not to lose herself in the confusion of feelings. But deep down, she knew what was growing between them was greater than either of them could control. And no matter how much they fought it, the heart, once touched, would never be the same. The mansion slept silently that night, wrapped in a thick fog that seemed to have crept from the fields into the stone and marble walls. It was as if the world outside had been reduced to a whisper, and the once busy hallways were now immersed in an almost solemn calm. Leah, after a particularly exhausting day, quietly washed her hands in the servants' lavatory. The chores had been doubled by Margaret's order after a complaint that some parts of the East Wing were not up to acceptable standards. Although the order hadn't come directly from Victoria, the scent of her interference was unmistakable. Even so, Leah kept her head held high. She was used to trials, but that day, something different pulsed inside her, a mixture of fatigue and unspoken expectation. Shortly before midnight, a messenger discreetly summoned her. It was one of Alexander's valets, tasked only with delivering direct and personal orders. He said the Lord wished to see her in his chambers. Leah's heart beat faster. Never before had Alexander summoned her at such a late hour, much less for a private meeting in his quarters, a space he had always maintained with an aura of mystery and respect. Even without knowing what to expect, she swapped her apron for a clean dress, gathered her hair in a simple bun, and walked through the dark hallways, accompanied only by the faint light of the wall sconces. There was a solemnity to that path, as if the entire house were silently watching her. Upon entering, she noticed that Alexander's room was surprisingly simple, yet imposing. The bookshelves covered almost every wall, and there was a woody scent in the air, mixed with discreet notes of tobacco and leather. He was waiting for her, standing in front of the lit fireplace. The fire cast shadows on his face, accentuating the sharp line of his jaw and the eyes that, although accustomed to command, that night seemed restless. Leah did not dare break the initial silence. There was an emotional weight in the room that felt older than both of them, as if something inevitable was about to happen. Alexander, his eyes still fixed on the flames, began to speak. His voice, firm, yet low, revealed something deeper than orders or instructions. He shared parts of his past that no one else had ever heard. Memories of the war, of days when death hovered so closely that the sound of gunfire no longer startled him. He spoke of his mother, of how her early absence had forced him to harden his heart, and of the demanding figure of his father, whose coldness had transformed the boy who once dreamed into a man trained to command without showing weakness. He spoke of losses that were never mourned, of loves that never blossomed for lack of time, and of a loneliness disguised as authority that had become his constant companion. Leah listened in silence. With every word, something inside her opened as well, as if Alexander's pains echoed through her own wounds. When he turned to face her, his eyes were different. Not the eyes of a master speaking to a servant, but those of a man stripped of his defenses before someone who understood him. Leah then, not knowing why, began to speak too. She shared fragments of her childhood before being separated from her family, of the night she was sold like merchandise, of the days in the brothel where her body was exposed, but her soul shrank. She told him about the nights when she wished she could disappear, and about the rare moments when she found refuge in old books, in impossible dreams, and in the stubborn hope that her life could still change. At that moment, the distance between them dissolved. Silence returned, but now it was different, dense, loaded with meaning. Alexander's eyes gently lowered to Leah's, and she, instead of retreating, held his gaze. There was no more tension, no hesitation. There was only an impulse that had been contained for far too long. When he approached, the world seemed to shrink, until only that space between the two of them remained. And then, it happened. The kiss, when it came, was not impetuous. It was a gesture laden with reverence and depth, as if they were both touching something sacred. Their lips met delicately, but there was a restrained intensity there, a silent outpouring of everything that had been accumulating in the silences, in the averted glances, in the unspoken words. For a moment, time stood still. The ghosts of both fell silent. However, the beauty of that instant was short-lived. When the touch ended, Alexander pulled back. The fire in his eyes was now replaced by a violent internal struggle. He withdrew without saying anything, visibly disturbed. Leah realized, with a lump in her throat, that he was torn. There was the man who wanted to be with her, who had felt her pain and connected with her soul. But there was also the Lord who bore on his shoulders the weight of a name, of a reputation, of a destiny written before he was even born. Alexander, in that moment, could not allow himself to fully give in to what he felt, even though everything inside him cried out for the opposite. Leah remained silent. She did not cry, nor did she complain. She only bowed slightly, respecting his choice even though she didn't fully understand it. She left the room without looking back, her heart ablaze but her face serene. She walked back to her quarters with slow steps, feeling the cold of the early morning seep into her bones. That night, she didn't sleep. She kept reliving the kiss, like an echo inside her, trying to find in it an answer that Alexander's silence hadn't given her. And although she didn't know what would come next, there was a new certainty in her chest. Something between them had changed forever. Alexander also found no rest. He spent the night in front of the fireplace, reliving every gesture, every word, every touch. He felt like a traitor, not to Leah, but to his own honor. He had sworn to himself that he would never get involved with someone under his protection, especially a woman who depended on him for everything. He feared hurting her, feared being mistaken for so many other men who had abused their position. But above all, he feared that by giving in to what they felt, they would both lose the little stability they had managed to build. Reason called him back to restraint, but his heart, now awakened, beat stronger and stronger. And even though he had tried to pull away, it was too late. The kiss that night had marked them both irreversibly. From that moment on, their destinies would move in a new direction, even if they didn't yet know exactly where. The atmosphere in the mansion had subtly changed since the night Leah left Alexander's quarters with her heart in conflict. Although no touch had been repeated, and no compromising words had been exchanged since then, something had become evident to those who knew how to observe. In the long, silent hallways, the servants whispered among themselves, always in low tones, as if they feared the walls could hear and repeat what was being said. All it took was for Leah to cross a hall, or approach a room for the conversations to abruptly stop, giving way to sidelong glances and expressions that ranged from curiosity to judgment, and in some cases, a hint of poorly disguised envy. She could feel the change on her skin, even though no one confronted her directly. It was like walking on invisible shards of glass. The routine, however, continued its course with precision. Margaret, as always, maintained an almost military rigidity, not allowing the movements among the servants to lose their rhythm. Leah, for her part, immersed herself in her work with even greater focus, trying to shield herself from the growing unease around her. She meticulously cleaned every surface, carefully arranged books, and never left a task incomplete. But even her unwavering dedication wasn't enough to neutralize the atmosphere of speculation that grew each day. The rumor, once whispered, began to spread to wings of the mansion that Leah didn't even frequent. And as with every rumor, the story gained its own versions, expanded and distorted with each new retelling. In this scenario, Victoria became an increasingly restless and unstable figure. Having been Alexander's lover for a long time, she couldn't bear the idea of being replaced, much less by someone who, in her distorted view, was inferior in every way. Victoria came from a respectable lineage, accustomed to the privileges of her position, and believed she had control over Alexander's heart, or at least his desire. To her, Leah was nothing more than an opportunistic maid, a former prostitute with no name or past, whose presence should have been discarded after the first week. The fact that Alexander still kept her close and, worse, showed a veiled care for her, was something Victoria couldn't accept. Her jealousy, once silent, now burned with fury in her eyes. It was in this emotional state that Victoria began to act more boldly. She created planned situations to humiliate Leah in front of other servants, spread even more scandalous rumors about the young woman, and insinuated, in a disguised manner, that Leah used her body to manipulate her master. In one of the cruelest moments, Victoria pretended to need help organizing the gowns in the noble wing, and when she called Leah to assist her, deliberately spilled an inkwell over a rare fabric from France. Then, she accused Leah of carelessness, demanding that Margaret punish the young woman severely. Although Margaret had considered the accusation absurd, the weight of Victoria's name prevented any public contestation. Leah was forced to endure the humiliation in silence, as she had done so many other times throughout her life. However, the limit was crossed on a rainy night, when Victoria, already overtaken by a sense of imminent defeat, confronted Leah directly. She waited for her in the dark hallway that led to the library, and with venomous words, threatened to expose her to all of society. She said she would reveal details of her past, invent worse stories if necessary, and that no one, not even Alexander, would protect her when ruin finally reached her. What Victoria didn't know, however, was that Alexander, upon returning from a business trip to the city, had decided to pass through the library before going up to his quarters. And upon hearing the harsh whispers coming from the hallway, he quietly approached. The scene that followed was marked by an icy tension. Alexander, witnessing Victoria's cruelty and Leah's silent courage, realized that what had once seemed like restrained jealousy had turned into something corrosive and dangerous. The disappointment in his eyes was immediate, and without raising his voice or allowing himself to lose control, he made a definitive decision. The next day, with the first rays of sunlight, an order was given. Victoria was to leave the mansion immediately. No explanation was provided to the servants, but it was enough for her trunks to be hurriedly loaded onto the carriage, for everyone to understand that something serious had happened. The news of the expulsion spread like wildfire across a dry field. The rumors, once contained, now became uncontrollable. Some servants said Victoria had been caught trying to poison Leah. Others claimed she had attempted to seduce Alexander in a final act of desperation and had been humiliatingly rejected. Each version took on more dramatic tones, reflecting the hidden desires and fears of those who spread them. Leah, for her part, remained silent. She didn't boast, didn't cry, nor did she hide. She continued her usual work, but there was a new firmness in her gestures, as if the dignity she had always carried had finally been recognized. Even if discreetly, Alexander offered no explanations to anyone. His stance remained firm and discreet, but his presence beside Leah became more visible. He spent more time in the library, left short notes with literary tasks for her to complete, and watched her with increasingly attentive eyes. The tension between them was growing once more, but now there was a layer of public respect that hadn't existed before. It was as if, by defending Leah, Alexander had taken a clearer stance, not only for others, but for himself. What no one could deny was that the mansion had changed. Order still reigned, and Margaret maintained a firm grip on the staff, But now there was an air of uncertainty hanging over everyone. What would happen next? Would Leah be promoted? Removed? Would she marry the Lord? Although these questions weren't spoken aloud, they danced in the eyes of the servants, and even the occasional guests. Leah, as always, walked with discretion, but every step she took was followed by watchful eyes. And even without seeking notoriety, she had become the involuntary center of a story that had grown beyond her control. During that time, Leah began to sleep more restlessly. The kiss she had shared with Alexander still pulsed within her, but now there was another weight on her shoulders. The fact that her presence had triggered such intense conflicts. She felt guilty, though deep down she knew she had done nothing more than exist with dignity. Meanwhile, Alexander, isolated in his study most nights, tried to find a balance between the duties the world expected of him and the feelings that were blooming without permission. And though there had been no words exchanged between them since the night of the kiss, every gesture, every silent gaze made it clear that the story between them was far from over. In truth, it was only beginning to reveal its true strength, a strength that would soon put everything they believed to be unchangeable to the test. The news arrived as a whisper, but quickly spread like a silent thunder through the mansion's halls. Leah would no longer be treated as a servant. She was now the future wife of Lord Alexander. To many, it seemed like a scandal teetering on the edge of madness, a brutal break in the natural order of things, an affront to the traditions that upheld the invisible structures of nobility. To others, even if silently, it represented a kind of poetic justice, a victory of essence over blood, of inner strength over family name. But for Leah, the revelation caused such deep confusion that it took days for her to grasp the magnitude of the change. It wasn't just a change in title, a new social role. It was a total rupture with the woman she had been, the servant, the fugitive, the silent spectator of her own life. Margaret was the first to approach after Alexander's decision. Her rigid posture seemed to have softened a bit, though her gestures were still calculated. She led Leah to a new room, located on the mansion's second floor, in a wing reserved only for important guests and family members. The room was spacious, with windows overlooking the main garden, and delicate linen curtains that danced softly with the slightest breeze. The floor was covered in oriental rugs, and the large wardrobe had already been filled with dresses, corsets, and shoes. There was also a vanity with a gold-framed mirror, covered with perfumes, brushes, and frosted glass bottles. It all felt unreal to Leah, as if she had been placed inside a story that didn't belong to her. In the days that followed, she went through a process of physical and symbolic transformation. Seamstresses were called to tailor the outfits to her body. Jewelers came to measure her fingers and neck. A hairdresser was hired exclusively to care for the hair that, once tied in simple braids or hidden under modest scarves, was now styled into elaborate updos with pearl pins and satin ribbons. With each new step, Leah felt further away from the woman who had once walked the dirty streets of a cold city, sold like merchandise, reduced to invisibility. But at the same time, she felt disconnected from the new version being molded around her. It was as if the surface was being sculpted, but the core of her soul remained rooted in the land she came from, in the pain, the memory, the silent resilience that had sustained her for so many years. Alexander, despite his courageous decision, kept a certain distance during this period. He observed from afar, but allowed Leah to go through the process in her own time. There was an implicit respect in his absence, a kind of unspoken understanding that this change couldn't be imposed as easily as signing a contract. By calling her his future wife, he hadn't just offered her a new position, but the opportunity to redefine her very existence. Leah felt the weight of that choice with every sunrise, as if she had to learn how to breathe to a new rhythm, to walk with a body that now carried a different kind of attention, more intense, more watched, more expected. The climax of this transition would be the ball at the castle, an event organized by the royal family to celebrate trade and political alliances between noble and aristocratic families of the region. Alexander, as an influential figure, had been invited with honors, and decided that Leah would accompany him. Preparations for the event took over the days and nights leading up to the ball. In addition to clothing and accessories, Leah began etiquette lessons with a French lady hired especially for the occasion. She learned how to behave at the table, how to walk with balance even while wearing dresses that restricted movement, how to respond to greetings and hold eye contact without appearing defiant. It was an exhausting training, but Leah faced it with silent determination. Each new lesson was a layer added on top of the last, not to erase it, but to strengthen it. Despite all her efforts, there were moments when Leah felt completely out of place. During dance rehearsals, she tripped over her own dress. When trying on jewelry, she hesitated to touch them, as if afraid they would fall apart in her hands. The etiquette teacher's words sometimes sounded like unreachable commands, and even Margaret's softened gaze still held the judgment of someone who saw an imposter, trying to assume a throne she wasn't born to. In those moments, Leah took refuge in the only place where she still felt whole, the library. Even though she was no longer a servant, she asked permission to keep visiting. It was among the books that she found a peace no silk or diamond could provide. She read voraciously, as if the words were steps leading her to a place where she could finally exist without masks. Deep down, Leah understood that acceptance of this new world wouldn't come from the outside, but from within. It wasn't enough for others to call her a lady, for Alexander to want her as his wife, or for the maids to now curtsy as she passed. She needed to recognize herself in this new skin. She had to transform not just her appearance, but her self-perception. And that process would not be completed with dresses or perfumes, but through the reconciliation of all the versions she had once inhabited. The girl who had been sold, the maid who endured humiliation in silence, the woman who awakened silent desires in a powerful man. All these parts needed to come together for her to finally become a new woman. As the ball approached, Leah was no longer just a shadow in the back of the room. Her presence gained weight, voice, and space. The staff began referring to her with more care. Some visitors, upon passing through the mansion, already greeted her as a lady. And although insecurity still lingered, Leah began walking with a bit more confidence. The memories of her past, no matter how painful, no longer weakened her. On the contrary, they gave her roots, and the more she accepted her journey, the stronger she became. It wasn't a transformation of appearance. It was a rebirth. The grand ball at the castle approached with the grandeur of a silent storm, the kind no one could stop, only prepare for. For Leah, it was more than a night of music and dance. It was the peak of a transformation born not of luxury, but of survival, resilience, and ultimately, love. When the golden carriage finally stopped at the top of the staircase lined with scarlet carpet, she stepped down with the grace of someone who had rehearsed every step, yet with a soul still trembling before the magnitude of what she was about to face. At her side, Alexander held the composed air of nobility, but his eyes revealed a quiet pride, as if he wished to say to the world, without speaking, that this woman was his choice. Leah wore a long, pearly satin gown that embraced her silhouette with the same reverence that fate now seemed to embrace her. Around her neck, a sapphire necklace delicately set in silver shimmered in the candlelight, as if reflecting all the courage she had gathered to arrive there. As she crossed the main hall, the stares that fell upon her ranged from surprise, to fascination, to judgment. Leah felt each one like silent arrows cutting through the heavy air of unspoken expectations. Some guests whispered among themselves, trying to hide their disbelief. Others, more reserved, simply observed her, searching for flaws, cracks, any trace of misfit that might confirm their theory that she didn't belong. But Leah didn't falter. Every step, every gesture, was an act of silent defiance. She knew she carried the prejudice of others, the malicious whispers, and the memories of a past many would rather ignore. Yet she also knew that her presence there was not a favor or a concession. It was a triumph. Alexander remained close, but never overbearing. He allowed Leah to move among the guests, trusting her intelligence and instincts. In no time, she found herself surrounded by members of high society, among them Eleanor and Edward, siblings of a rival lord, known for their sharp tongues and arrogance disguised as sophistication. Eleanor, with her cold smile and eyes dark as night, made comments masked as compliments, trying to expose Leah's past and unsettle her. Edward, with a glass of wine in hand and an air of superiority bordering on mockery, provoked with insinuations and cruel questions, as if testing the resilience of something foreign. But Leah, instead of retreating, rose with elegance and responded with the subtlety of someone who understands the weight of words. Each of her answers was a dance of wit and poise, enough to unnerve the two without ever losing her composure. Her gaze never dropped, her voice never trembled, and her posture said more than any argument ever could. She wasn't begging for acceptance. She was earning it. Leah's strength began to win over even the most skeptical. One of the few who approached without pretense was Grace, a young woman of the local nobility, known for her generosity and sensitivity. Unlike the others, she did not hesitate to treat Leah with genuine kindness. There was something in Grace that reminded Leah of who she had been before the scars. Someone who also felt out of place in that world of fake smiles and alliances made for convenience. The connection between the two was instant. Amid conversations about art, literature, and the world beyond the castle gates, Leah felt, perhaps for the first time, the glimpse of a true friendship within that quiet jungle of vanity and social codes. As the orchestra filled the hall with waltzes and minuets, Alexander approached and offered her his arm. Their first turn on the ballroom floor was the peak of a moment carefully built since the night he took her from the brothel. Leah danced as if the world around her had fallen silent, as if each step in rhythm with the music was rewriting her own story. That night, she was not the maid, the woman hidden among books and dust, nor the shadow of a shameful past. She was light, she was presence, now a living part of that grand scene. And everyone felt it. Even those who turned up their noses at her origins couldn't ignore the natural way she moved, the steadiness of her gaze, and the grace that seemed to radiate from every gesture. Rumors inevitably began to spread. But contrary to what many expected, the talk wasn't just about scandal or supposed missteps. They spoke of Alexander's courage in defying archaic traditions, of Leah's intelligence in her comportment among nobles, of a beauty that went beyond dresses and jewels, a beauty found in the way she commanded respect without ever submitting. Leah had walked through the castle doors as a possible imposter, but left it as an undeniable presence. That night, with all its trials, stares, and confrontations disguised as courtesy, had become her greatest triumph. On the way back to the mansion, inside the carriage, Leah didn't need words to express what she felt. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and admiration, recognizing not just the beauty now seen by the world, but the strength he had always known, in silences, in discreet gestures, in moments they had shared far from prying eyes. The ball had ended, but something far greater had begun. Leah had not only been accepted, she had claimed her place. And for a woman who had come from the shadows, that was the brightest triumph fate could offer. The return from the ball carried a quiet, unlike any night Leah and Alexander had shared before. There was no longer the tense silence of uncertainty, nor the hesitation that used to linger in restrained gestures or diverted glances. In the carriage, the darkness was broken only by the glow of the outer lanterns, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Leah felt a warmth in the air that didn't come just from body heat or physical closeness, but from something deeper, a bond that, though unspoken, now pulsed with intensity and truth. Alexander, always reserved in his emotions, seemed overtaken by an impulse he could no longer hide. That moment, so intimate and solemn, marked the instant he broke through the last walls still holding him to convention, declaring with clarity everything his heart had been holding since she entered his life. But it wasn't a theatrical or impulsive declaration. It was something deep, sustained by all they had lived through together, the sacrifices, the shared pain, the silent choices that had brought them closer, day by day. Leah listened, absorbing every word, every gesture, every nuance of that revealed feeling. Although her soul was on fire, taken by a whirlwind of emotions that blended desire, tenderness, fear, and enchantment, she didn't give in to the impulse to surrender in that moment. Not because of a lack of love, nor out of insecurity, but because of something that transcended the moment, a need to build what they were creating with solidity. She knew how much it cost to trust, how risky it was to fully give herself to someone, even when that someone showed her respect and affection. In her silence, there was a strength that Alexander understood without needing words. The act of waiting, of choosing the right time to fully live that love, was, in fact, one of the greatest proofs of love she could offer. When they arrived at the mansion, the atmosphere between them had already changed. The servants discreetly stepped away, aware that something had transformed. Leah went up to her room, but she didn't carry with her just the delicate fabrics of the dress or the shine of the jewelry. She carried the certainty that she was now emotionally intertwined with Alexander in a way that went beyond the physical or romantic. It wasn't just attraction or admiration, it was something more, It was the birth of a bond so deep it didn't require words. In her solitude, standing before the mirror, Leah observed the reflection of the new woman emerging, strong, serene, but still cautious. She touched the necklace Alexander had given her, not as a symbol of status, but as a reminder of the journey that had brought them there. It was as if each stone on the necklace told a part of their story, the silent pain, the fears they had overcome, the tenderness that bloomed in the smallest gestures. The next morning, life at the mansion went on as usual, but nothing felt the same. There was a subtlety in their movements, a lightness disguised as formality. When their eyes met, the exchange carried deeper meanings than any conversation. The mutual respect between them had intensified, and it showed in every detail, in the care Alexander showed her in front of others, in the way Leah carried herself with dignity and grace, even under the most critical gazes. Their relationship had reached a new stage, more mature, more grounded, where love was no longer just a feeling, but a conscious choice, made with clarity and courage. And that choice wasn't expressed through whispered words in the dark, but in gestures of respect and the shared decision to move slowly, giving their feelings the time needed to fully bloom. The bond that strengthened with each passing day was no longer fragile or vulnerable to outside threats. There was a solid foundation now, built not only on promises, but on real actions. Alexander, fully aware of the responsibility he took on by loving Leah, didn't just protect her. He valued her, listened to her, stood beside her as an equal. And Leah, in turn, didn't let herself be shaped solely by the other's desires. She kept her identity, her essence, making that love not erase her story, but honor it. Their relationship was like a restrained dance, where each step was taken with intention, with care, with truth. There was no rush, no eagerness to make everything happen at once, because both understood that what they were building was greater than a night of passion. It was a bond meant to stand the test of time. The days that followed were filled with a quiet intensity, almost sacred. They walked together in the gardens, read side by side in the library, exchanged discreet smiles during meals. They didn't need constant declarations. Simply being there, sharing, staying was enough. It was as if every simple moment carried within it the depth of a silent commitment. Leah, now confident in her feelings, felt she could fully trust, not only in Alexander's love, but in her own ability to love without fear, without the chains of the past. And Alexander increasingly surrendered to Leah's calm strength, respected the boundaries she set, understanding that true love doesn't impose. It waits, it welcomes, it understands. In that night held between passion and tenderness, the two of them understood something that many never grasp in a lifetime. That desire, when guided by respect, is even more intense. That love, when nourished by patience and care, blooms with deep roots. And it was that understanding, built through silence, glances, and presence, that sealed between them a connection that not even time or future conflicts could undo. They were ready, not to live a fleeting fantasy, but to build a real love story, made of truth, of pain overcome, and of choices made with a peaceful heart. Even after being expelled from the mansion, Victoria did not accept the end of her influence nor the public humiliation she had suffered in front of everyone. Wounded in her pride, fueled by an obsession that had already crossed the limits of reason, she began to wander through the shadows of society, like a bitter specter from Alexander's past. Her once admired beauty now concealed a soul corroded by envy and a thirst for revenge. She fed on gossip in salons and whispers in the hallways of country estates and discreet events. Where once there were smiles of false courtesy, silence now reigned in her presence. But Victoria didn't care. Her mind was fixated on one goal: to destroy Leah, to tear her from Alexander's life, and to make him pay for what she considered an unforgivable betrayal. Far from all of this, Leah was going through a period of silent and profound transformation. Even with the progress her life had undergone, the sudden social rise, the respect she had earned within Alexander's household, the love silently cultivated, the ghosts of the past still visited her in moments of solitude. Behind the serene smile she wore in the salons and the noble posture she had learned to carry, there was a heart bearing deep scars. Leah knew that, in the eyes of society, she was still a woman of questionable origin. It was impossible to erase the veiled judgmental looks, the disguised whispers in the hallways, the way some ladies let their eyes slide over her as if examining something out of place. And that hurt more than she liked to admit, because despite her inner strength, there was still a young woman inside her who battled the fear of not being enough, of embarrassing the man who now offered her not just protection, but true love. Alexander, though always attentive, seemed unaware of the depth of the fears Leah kept hidden. He saw her as strong, unshakable, a woman who had earned everything through her own merit, and in a way, that was true. But that view ignored the invisible cracks Leah disguised with dignity. She carried within her the constant fear that, at any moment, something from her past could be used against her. The fact that she had come from a place of pain and submission still weighed heavily on her shoulders. Even among servants who now treated her with reverence and guests who bowed their heads out of respect, Leah knew she was not fully accepted. The fear of disappointing Alexander, of becoming a burden to him in society's eyes, sometimes kept her awake at night. There were nights when she remained motionless by the window, gazing into the dark vastness of the gardens, searching for answers where she found only the reflection of her own dilemmas. Meanwhile, Victoria moved in the shadows. She knew that to bring Leah down, she needed more than just scandals. She needed strategy. She began to approach influential figures who were dissatisfied with Alexander, men and women who felt threatened by his recent decisions, especially his refusal to pursue advantageous political alliances. Victoria offered poisonous smiles, delicate gifts, and carefully manipulated information. She presented herself as an unjustly wronged woman, discarded by an ungrateful lover, replaced by a girl with no pedigree, no name, no place in the aristocracy. Her narrative gained traction behind the scenes, and while the seeds of doubt were being planted, Leah remained unaware of the true extent of the danger approaching. The atmosphere around the mansion began to change. Regular guests started declining dinner invitations. Some suppliers began delaying deliveries. Small tensions began to arise among the servants, who murmured about strange letters received, rumors being spread, and visits from unknown figures in the area. Alexander, alert, suspected external movements but still didn't understand their origin. Leah, for her part, only felt the growing sense of unease in the air, as if something were about to collapse. She sensed that, despite Alexander's affection and the respect she had earned, there was a thin line between acceptance and tolerance, and it would only take a spark to reignite the judgments that had never truly gone away. The internal fears, once kept in check, began to echo louder, taking shape in her most intimate thoughts. During this time, Leah became more withdrawn than usual. She secluded herself in solitary reading, silent walks, and discreet prayers. She avoided the gazes of the servants and the shallow conversations of the ladies who came to visit her out of self-interest. She felt that something was slipping through her fingers, even without knowing exactly what. Her intuition, sharpened by past pains, warned her that it wasn't just paranoia, and she was right. Victoria had sent letters to influential nobles, insinuating that Leah had been involved with powerful clients at Madame Vivian's brothel, that her rise was the result of manipulation and well-executed seductions. Even without concrete proof, the accusations spread like poison in clean water, contaminating reputations and alliances with the speed of a wildfire. The pressure was mounting. Alexander, despite his unwavering love, began to face political and social challenges. Leah, even without knowing exactly what the rumors said, could feel that her presence by his side was a heavier burden than she had hoped. In her mind, their love, once pure and promising, was beginning to be tested by the forces she had always feared: prejudice, malice, and social cruelty. Yet still, Leah did not retreat. Even though the ground trembled beneath her feet, she stood firm. She would not run, would not hide her past, and would not allow Victoria or anyone else poisoned by hatred to make her forget the woman she had become. The battle was still silent, but its echoes already resonated through the mansion's halls and in the hearts of those who watched from afar. Leah was about to face her greatest challenge, not an escape, nor a direct rejection, but the fight for her dignity in a world that insisted on reminding her where she came from. The shadows were thickening, and the enemies no longer lingered at the edges. They were drawing near, masked as allies, armed with venomous words and destructive intentions. But Leah, with a soul forged in pain and refined through love, would not give in. Not anymore. The sky was clear, and the evening light bathed the mansion's gardens in golden tones, as if nature itself silently blessed what was to come. The trees swayed gently, and the servants moved swiftly, adjusting final details, preparing rooms, trimming the last imperfections in a setting that, on that night, would cease to be merely a noble residence and become the stage of a turning point. Alexander, resolved and calm, was preparing to do what many would consider far too bold, to present to the world his definitive choice. Leah, now recognized by all in the mansion as someone far beyond the maid she once was, had no idea that in just a few hours her life would be turned upside down again, but this time, by something that, though born from love, also carried the weight of expectations, social consequences, and the still healing wounds of her origin. The invitations had been sent in advance. The ballroom had been decorated with care, every detail reflecting the elegance that had always characterized Alexander's events. However, there was a subtle difference that night. It could be felt in the air, a solemn tension, as if everyone present knew something important was about to unfold. The guests, many of whom still struggled to understand Leah's constant presence beside the host, arrived in their finest clothes, but carried in their eyes the weight of curiosity and judgment. To many, she was still an intruder, someone not born to hold that place. To others, she was merely a passing phase, a distraction for Alexander. But for him, there was no longer room for doubt. What he felt for Leah could no longer remain in the shadows, or behind discreet whispers. It was time to make public what his heart had been shouting for a long time. Leah descended the stairs slowly, wrapped in a dress carefully chosen by Margaret. The gown, embroidered in pearl and gold tones, subtly highlighted her beauty, but it wasn't the dress that drew attention. It was her posture, her serenity. She walked with the dignity of a woman who had faced hell and returned whole, shaped by pain, and guided by something greater than pride, the truth of her essence. All eyes turned to her, some in surprise, others with veiled scorn, but she didn't look away. Her body trembled on the inside, not from fear of those present, but from the weight of the choice she knew stood before her. Alexander waited in the center of the room, with the same steadiness he used to face business battles, but with a light in his eyes that made it clear. This moment wasn't about power or social convention. It was about love. The music stopped. The murmurs quieted into an expectant silence. Alexander raised his hand calmly, and then, without hesitation, made public what had long been irrevocable for him. Leah was the woman he had chosen to love, honor, and protect in front of everyone, without reservation. This was not a union of interests, nor a fleeting whim. It was the official declaration of a feeling built brick by brick amid chaos, pain, and resilience. The revelation struck like a stone against the fragile structures of high society. Murmurs spread. Some faces went pale. Others, hidden behind smiles, showed disbelief. But Leah, even as her heart pounded faster with each second, stood tall, unwavering. Her soul swayed between gratitude and fear. She knew how much that gesture would cost Alexander, and how much it might cost her. Deep inside, Leah was overtaken by a wave of confusion. Not because she doubted Alexander's love, but because she understood with striking clarity the consequences that would come with that exposure. Being officially introduced as the future wife of one of the most respected men in the country meant defying all the unspoken rules that dictated everyone's place in the social hierarchy. It meant confronting an elite that, though polished on the outside, was cruel and relentless to those who dared break its standards. It meant being under constant scrutiny, hearing sharp whispers, having every gesture analyzed, every mistake magnified, and more than that, it meant having her story searched, exposed, distorted. Leah hesitated. For a brief moment, she thought of backing out, sparing them both from the scorn she could already see in the surrounding eyes. But then her gaze met Alexander's, and there was no fear there, only certainty. He looked at her as if to say, without words, that she was not alone, that everything she feared would be faced together, that his choice was not an act of charity, nor a rebellion against the system. It was love, simple and deep. Leah took a deep breath. There was no room left for doubt. The time had come to leave behind the last remnants of the past and embrace a future that, though uncertain, promised to be built on respect and truth. Her hand touched his, and that simple gesture, made in front of so many hostile eyes, sealed the silent commitment between them, to walk together, even if it meant treading a stony path. The room erupted with restrained reactions. Some toasted with false smiles. Others, silently, left before the event ended. But none of that mattered. The choice had been made. In the days that followed, the echoes of that announcement spread through social circles. Newspapers published malicious columns. Anonymous letters were sent to members of Alexander's board. Invitations to important events began to dwindle. And even within the mansion, some servants showed discomfort. But Alexander did not back down. He reaffirmed his position with strength, severing ties he once thought unbreakable, and staying true to what his heart told him was right. Leah, for her part, displayed even greater strength than before. Even under the weight of stares and criticism, she maintained her composure, her gentleness, her dignity. She did not stoop to provocations, nor did she try to please those who clearly disdained her presence. Her weapon was silence, her defense, the truth of who she was. And little by little, that love born from pain and grown through trials began to win over even the hardest hearts. Some, once resistant, started to see in Leah not a threat, but a woman whose story inspired. Someone who, even having come from the ground, walked with her head held high and her heart intact. Others, even if they didn't accept her, learned to respect Alexander's choice, recognizing that, in the face of such loyalty and strength, no argument could stand. Their love didn't ask for permission or justification. It only needed to exist. And that, in itself, was the greatest declaration. Leah's acceptance, silent and resolute, was more than an act of love. It represented the final break with the past, the surrender to the present, and the confident embrace of the future. In her heart, there was a sweet hope, built not on illusions, but on the concrete foundation of everything she had lived with Alexander. Even though she knew the days ahead would not be easy, she allowed herself to dream. For the first time, Leah envisioned the possibility of a life in which she wouldn't be defined by the circumstances that once imprisoned her, but by her own choices. With her eyes set on the horizon and her heart entwined with Alexander's, she understood that love, when true, didn't promise an easy path, only the strength to keep walking, even through thorns. And with that awareness, the two began the next chapter of their story. The wedding preparations didn't follow the traditional molds of aristocracy. Alexander, aware that the world around them would never fully accept his decision, chose something more discreet, yet no less meaningful. The ceremony was held in the estate's gardens, surrounded by flowers gathered from the grounds, with a few guests and no excessive formalities. What mattered, after all, wasn't the grandeur of the event, but the commitment between two souls who had found each other in the shadows and decided to walk in the light. Margaret, once stern and distant, now took part with a proud, quiet sparkle in her eyes. The servants who had witnessed the quiet growth of that love were also present. Some moved, others still in the process of accepting, but all, in some way, were touched by the transformation unfolding before them. Leah wore a simple yet elegant dress, crafted by careful hands that had come to respect the woman behind the story. It wasn't the gown that made her special in that moment, but what it represented: freedom, dignity, rebirth. Beside her, Alexander remained calm, but not indifferent. It was as if every beat of his heart echoed the silent promise to protect her, not only from external threats, but from the inner insecurities that still lingered in the corners of Leah's soul. The wedding, held on a warm spring afternoon, sealed more than just a union. It was the definitive turning point. From that moment on, there would be no more master and maid, no savior and saved. They were simply two people, imperfect, marked by time and choices, deciding to bet on one another, with everything that entailed. Shortly after the ceremony, the couple departed, not in a luxurious carriage or under the flash of the press. They were discreet, walking down the estate's tree-lined path with the ease of those simply following their own way. The road ahead was long, and they knew the winds of change would blow hard. There would be resistance, criticism, invisible barriers. But Leah was no longer the uncertain young woman who had arrived at Madame Vivian's brothel, nor the maid who had learned to hide her feelings in the silence of the library. She was now a whole woman, shaped by every tear she had shed and every brave choice she had made. And Alexander, in turn, was no longer just the lord of the mansion. the heir to an empire. He had become someone capable of renouncing privileges and alliances in the name of something far greater, the truth of his feelings. However, even as the carriage moved forward down the road, leaving behind the walls of the mansion that held so much symbolism, something watched them from the shadows. Victoria, once expelled and forgotten, now re-emerged as a ghostly presence. Hidden between columns and veils, she witnessed, unnoticed, every detail of the ceremony. Her eyes, once filled with vanity and desire, now burned with resentment and frustration. To her, Leah was not a triumphant woman, but a usurper. Everything Alexander had denied her was now being given to someone who, in her twisted view, never even deserved to walk through the front door. Victoria, consumed by a silent thirst for revenge, made no scenes, left no traces. But her lack of reaction did not mean surrender. It was merely the beginning of something darker, still germinating in silence. Leah and Alexander's new life began on a remote estate where they hoped to cultivate a quieter routine, far from cruel gazes and the power games of high society. The surrounding nature, serene and generous, offered the perfect refuge to rebuild their days. Leah began dedicating herself to small social projects, helping other women in vulnerable situations, a way to give meaning to her own story and turn her wounds into bridges for others. Alexander, though still involved in his business affairs, reorganized his priorities, allowing love to take center stage in his life. They learned to laugh at the little things, to respect each other's silences, and to share the burden of memories with lightness. But, like every real life, even the peaceful moments carried their shadows. The world around them hadn't changed just because they had. Rumors continued to spread. Contracts were lost. Business partnerships dissolved. Leah became the target of malicious articles and venomous comments at public events. Some of Alexander's friends quietly abandoned him. In certain circles, it was still common to hear jokes about Leah's past, always spoken behind her back, of course. And while it hurt, she learned to endure, because beside Alexander, she discovered that no external humiliation was greater than the strength of someone who has faced their own abyss and chosen to live. And in time, the scandal cooled, giving way to a suspicious silence that, though uncomfortable, was bearable. Even amid constant challenges, Leah and Alexander found ways to keep alive what united them. Their nights were filled with honest conversations, exchanged glances that said more than words, small gestures that rekindled the flame. They knew the struggle would be ongoing, but they also knew they had found something rare, true companionship. It wasn't a fairy tale, and maybe that's what made it so powerful. It was real, made of pain and wonder, losses and victories, courage and vulnerability. And despite the silent threat still lingering in the shadows, personified in Victoria, the couple kept moving forward. Because in the end, their love didn't depend on the acceptance of others, but on the faith they placed in each other when everything seemed lost. Thus, the story of Leah and Alexander didn't end with a final conclusion, but with a new beginning, a fresh start built on hope, constructed from the ruins of prejudice and cemented by courage. And even though Victoria's vengeful gaze still followed them from afar, they didn't let fear paralyze them, because they knew that life, with all its ups and downs, was fertile ground for those who chose to plant with truth. And that was exactly what they intended to do, to cultivate, together, the garden of a life built with love, respect, and resilience. And as the world kept turning around them, Leah and Alexander carried on, step by step, writing their own story,